This week on Koine Corner, we are addressing a viewer request. The request comes from none other than the Compressor Guru. If you haven't seen the Compressor Guru on YouTube, you're missing out on a lot of fascinating information about not just compressors and compressed air and dehumidification and things like that, but all things mechanical, all things that require a sense of how things work. So the Compressor Guru asked a question about the passage where Jesus says it's easier for a camel to go through the eye of a needle than for a rich man to enter the kingdom of God. So this is a story that appears in all three of the synoptic gospels, but not in John. We're going to start out by looking at all three of them. I'm reading from the ESV, and the first appearance is in Matthew 19:24, where it says, "Again I tell you, it is easier for a camel to go through the eye of a needle than for a rich person to enter the kingdom of God." The next one is in Mark 10:25, "For it is easier for a camel to go through the eye of a needle than for a rich person to enter the kingdom of God." And then we get to Luke 18:25, where it says, "For it is easier for a camel to go through the eye of a needle than for a rich person to enter the kingdom of God." It seems very consistent, doesn't it? And it largely is. But there's enough subtlety here for us to draw some significant conclusions. Traditionally, this passage has two issues that come up. The first one is raised by the disciples themselves. If a rich man can't get into heaven, who can? So what's the point of bothering? What's the point of a regular person bothering to try? The second question is, should we take this literally or figuratively? In other words, are we talking about a big furry camel being jammed through the eye of a sewing needle, or should we take it figuratively that the eye of a needle is the name of a gate in Jerusalem? Some people suggest that it's a skinny gate, that it would be difficult for you to get a camel to pass through that gate. First up, let's address the question of why bother trying. Okay, so each one of the three passages, when Jesus says it is easier, that is eukapoteron estin. So estin, it is. Eukapoteron is a comparative adjective. It is easier. So you know you're going to have two things here, right? It's easier for, then we get the camel in the eye of the needle, than, because we have to have something to compare it to, a rich man to enter into the kingdom of God. So why try? Why bother? Why do this thing? Well, Jesus says elsewhere that you can't serve two masters, right? So the comparison telling us that this is really, really difficult, but notice he doesn't say it's impossible, he just says it's really, really difficult. It's difficult to serve two masters, whether it be money, whether it be anything else that takes that place of priority in a person's life. So we can set that one question aside, why try? He's not saying it's impossible. He's using a paradoxical metaphor, something that seems impossible, to give us an instruction about something that's very, very difficult. Now we move on to the second question. The second issue is, should we take this figuratively or literally? Well, here's some great news. This is not original material. Jesus is borrowing from the Talmud. In the Talmud, there's a passage that describes something being more difficult than an elephant passing through the eye of a needle. So presuming, we know that all of Jesus' original disciples are Jewish. He is communicating to a largely Jewish audience in his earthly ministry, and they will recognize this Talmudic reference, the elephant passing through the eye of a needle. He appropriates the metaphor and applies it to the largest mammal living in the Middle East. So something that they're more familiar with, We can assume that none of them had ever seen an elephant. They know what an elephant is, they've heard it described, but probably none of them have ever seen an elephant. But most of them, if not all of them, have seen a camel. So he appropriates this reference from the Talmud. Next thing, what we have to look at is the story as captured by Matthew, Mark, and Luke has the same, the theological term is the Sitzim Leben, the life setting. It's the same story with the same setup and the same audience told the same way, essentially in all three tellings. So the consistency of the audience and the setting should mean that we would interpret the three tellings the same way, right? That helps support that notion. But then each one of them describes the phrase eye of the needle or the eye of a needle differently. And that is significant. Let's take a look at all three of them. We'll go through them one at a time. So here we have, I haven't put up any of the English. We're just going to talk through the Koine here because we've already heard the English and how the English translations all sound virtually identical. I'm starting with the camel. So let's just start with Matthew. Camel dia trupematos raphidos dielthein. So Matthew talks about a camel going through the pierced hole. Trupematos is a pierced hole. Have you ever seen a blacksmith drift a hole into a piece of iron? They get it cherry red, put it on the anvil, and they take a drift, which is kind of like a punch, and using a hammer, they punch or pierce a hole through the material to create an opening. Matthew's account speaks of a pierced hole in a raphidos, in a needle, a sewing needle. So in other words, this is a needle made by a blacksmith, someone who very meticulously, while the metal was hot, pierced a hole through that became the eye of the needle. So that's his description. Jesus says it's easier for a camel to go through the pierced hole of a sewing needle, the eye of a sewing needle, than for a rich man to enter the kingdom of God. But this is interesting. Let's go on to Luke, and to Mark. And Mark says, "Camelon dia tes trumalias tes raphidos dielthein." Almost an identical sentence except for these two things. Later on, after Mark's gospel was written, some editor supplied articles here. Notice the tases in brackets. So the tases were not in the original text. They were added later by an editor. But more importantly than that, notice that he uses a different word for the eye of the needle. Trumalias. Trumalias is just a hole. Not necessarily a pierced hole like Matthew gave us, but just a hole. The hole of a needle in our parlance is the eye of a needle, right? So Mark comes along, tells the same story in the same setting with the same audience, the same context, and says, quotes Jesus as, "It is easier for a camel to fit through the hole in a sewing needle than for a rich man to enter the kingdom of God." Now we move on to Luke. Camelon dia trematos belones eselthein. He does a couple of interesting things here. The word for hole here is opening, not hole, but opening. And what is the opening in a needle? It's the eye of the needle, right? So it's a synonym, but we're not told if it's a pierced hole or if it's just a hole. We're just told the opening of a needle. Notice it's a different word for needle as well. Raphidos and belones are synonyms. Okay, so they both mean sewing needle. Don't read too much into it. If there was a significance in the difference in the two kinds of needles, we would talk about it, but they're just synonyms for sewing needle. Luke just prefers this word to the other, apparently. But here's what I think is significant. three significances. And let's jump in. The Talmudic reference is undeniable, right? His hearers recognize that he's talking about, he's alluding to an elephant fitting through the eye of a needle when he appropriates the term and says it's easier for a camel to fit through the eye of a needle. If this were to be taken as a gate in the wall of Jerusalem, it would obliterate that reference to the Talmud. It would introduce confusion, not clarity, in the teaching to his disciples. So for that reason, I think we can confidently say Jesus is talking about a real needle and not a needle as a gate. Let's go on to the next one. If it were a reference to a known landmark, to a gate in the wall of Jerusalem, we would expect the reference to be articular. It would be referred to as the eye of the needle or the eye of a needle, probably the eye of the needle, which we get literally in Mark's example, except going back, I'm going to peek back for a quick second so you can see it again. The articles were supplied later by an editor. The original text did not include the article tes. Well, why does this matter? Because articles are deictic. What does that mean? Articles point to things. So the question that we're addressing this week came to us from whom? It came to us from the Compressor Guru. The article is deictic and points to not just some Compressor Guru, but the Compressor Guru. If it was the eye of the needle, the gate, this commonly known gate, you would expect it to be articular. But in none of the original texts is it articular. That's important. It's not pointing to a specific well-known thing. If it were specifically pointing to a landmark, for that pointing to be effective, it has to be so commonly known that it has a name that everyone recognizes, right? So if I say to you, we're going to meet tonight at 9 o'clock at Dead Man's Curve, the place has to be well known. Dead Man's Curve has to be the known name. If some people refer to it as the Harrowing Radius, and some other people refer to it as the Ark of Many a Demise, then saying we're going to Dead Man's Curve is not going to guarantee that everybody shows up, because some people just call it the sharp bend on 350, right? So for a landmark's name to resonate with the audience and be an effective part of teaching, it has to be so ubiquitously known, everyone has to so commonly know the reference that they would automatically jump to that place. If that's the case, then Matthew, Mark, and Luke should all call it the same thing. It should be articular in all three cases, so the hearers would automatically know, oh, he's talking about Dead Man's Curve. He's talking about the eye of the needle, that super narrow gate that is like a man trap that you can't flood soldiers through. You can only really get one or two people at a time through there. Imagine trying to squeeze a camel through there. That would be a good allusion to a gate that may or may not have existed. But what it isn't, because they called it three different things, and they were not using the article to as a deictic thing to point to a specifically known gate. It's safe for us to conclude with the second issue that when Jesus said it's easier for a camel to fit through the eye of a needle, he meant it's easier to jam the furry keister of the largest mammal in the Middle East through the eye, whether it be a pierced opening, just a hole, or an opening. It's the eye of a literal sewing needle, regardless whether it's a raphidos or a ballones, either one, because they're synonyms. This great big camel passing through there, it's the comparative of the difficulty of getting a rich man into the kingdom of God. So, what do we conclude? Wealth makes entry into the kingdom a difficult challenge, like all competitors do. How difficult? It's as difficult as getting a camel through the eye of a needle. I hope that helps answer the question for whom? The Compressor Guru. Check out his channel when you get a chance, and I hope this was good for you as well. And if it was, please like, share, subscribe, hit the notification bell, all that good stuff. And until we see each other again, Karis Kairene Humin, grace and peace to you.